Hello, I'm Bob McMaster. Welcome to this, another in a series of short Zoom talks on the life and legacy of Edward Hitchcock, this one entitled Edward Hitchcock's Tree of Life. In 1840, Edward Hitchcock published the first edition of his textbook, Elementary Geology. By then, he had been teaching geology for 15 years. And while his lectures were based largely on his research, he did recommend for his students recent works in the field, notably Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, Henry de la Beche's Researches in Theoretical Geology, and Robert Bakewell's Introduction to Geology. All of these were European authors with a European point of view. But Hitchcock was determined to publish a truly American text, one that reflected his own experiences, his own perspective on geology. Hitchcock chose as the frontispiece of his text a large hand-colored illustration entitled Paleontological Chart. Likely drawn by his wife, Ora, it received barely a mention by reviewers and critics at the time. But that chart has attracted more attention from science historians in recent times than any other part of elementary geology. Some have dubbed it Hitchcock's Tree of Life. The paleontological chart consists of two elongated tree-like diagrams displayed side by side, one labeled plants and one animals. The vertical axis is a time scale that includes the major geological periods as they were known in Hitchcock's day: Grey-Wacky, Carboniferous, Saliferous, Oolitic, Cretaceous, Tertiary, and Historic. At the base of the diagram of the plants are two groups. The lowest, the flowerless plants, with flowering plants a bit higher. Flowerless plants are further divided into terrestrial and marine, and flowering plants into monocots and dicots. Each of these groups is further divided, and by the historic period are represented by a number of groups: the conifers, the cycads, flowering plants, the palms, the lycopods, the horsetails, ferns and mosses, and seaweeds. An ornate crown rests on the palms, suggesting that they were the epitome of plant life on Earth. At the bottom of the diagram of the animal group are four groups: vertebral animals, molluscous animals, articulated animals, and radiated animals. These are further divided as one ascends the tree, with 17 groups at the top, representing the major animal groups on Earth, including fishes, lizards, birds, mammals, shellfish, spiders, insects, and corals. At the apex of the mammals is written the word man, adorned by his own crown. It would be tempting to conclude from the paleontological chart that Edward Hitchcock was espousing a two-lineage version of evolution, suggesting that all plants were derived from a common plant ancestor and all animals from a common animal ancestor. But that idea was not at all what lay behind this illustration. The French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was one of a number of early exponents of the idea of transmutation, that species of living things have been transformed into other species. Edward Hitchcock objected vehemently to any such notion. All life forms, he argued, were found as fossils in a range of rock formations, representing a great span of Earth's history. He wrote, "Hence we learn that the hypothesis of Lamarck is without foundation, which supposes there has been a transmutation of species from less to more perfect since the beginning of organic life on the globe." Hitchcock's paleontological chart then was not meant to suggest that lower groups gave rise to or were transmuted into higher groups. It simply illustrated the eras in which those groups were created. Furthermore, he contended, similarities between more recent groups and ancient groups were evidence not of a continuous lineage, but of a common plan or essence existing in the mind of the Almighty. If man resembled other mammals, it was not due to shared ancestry. It was simply a body plan favored by God in his wisdom. What worked for the primates, he must have reasoned, will work also for the human race. At the very time that Hitchcock's paleontological chart first appeared in print, Charles Darwin was constructing his own tree of life, but one based on a radically different conception of how life on Earth had developed. The similarities among groups of living things, past and present, Darwin posited, were evidence not of the wisdom of the Creator, but of common ancestry. Earlier groups gradually gave rise to later groups, entirely as a result of natural forces, although Darwin was still formulating his ideas about the nature of those forces. As early as 1837, he noted the powerful effects of artificial selection in breeding of pigeons, dogs, and livestock. If humans could produce such dramatic changes in species in a few generations, he reasoned, could not some similar processes be operating in nature, whereby species were changed, transmuted over time? Charles Darwin had high praise for Hitchcock's fossil footmarks research. In my opinion, he wrote in a letter to Hitchcock, these footsteps, with which subject your name is certain to go down to long future posterity, make one of the most curious discoveries of the present century and highly important in its several bearings. But their views of the development of life on Earth, while they might appear superficially similar, could not have been more different. Darwin's tree of life and his thoughts on the process of natural selection did not appear in print until 1859 in Origin of Species. It naturally enraged many religious leaders and authors, the suggestion that all life shared a common ancestor, the implication that man was just another tree on that twig. Well, in the 31st edition of Elementary Geology, co-authored by Edward and son Charles Hitchcock, and that was published just 3 years after Darwin's Origin of Species, contained a sharp critique of Darwin's hypothesis of transmutation of species and natural selection. The authors quoted Louis Agassiz, "The connection of faunas is not material, but resides in the thought of the Creator." Most tellingly, the Paleontological Chart, the frontispiece of 30 editions over 2 decades, was nowhere to be found. Hitchcock wanted nothing to do with Darwin's irreligious notions. In July of 1863, barely 6 months before his death, Hitchcock delivered his final published word on science and religion in the journal Bibliotheca Sacra. In an article entitled "Law of Nature's Constancy Subordinate to the Higher Law of Change," he addressed the greatest challenge to Orthodox Christianity of his time, the writings of Charles Darwin. Needless to say, he disapproved. He first raised concerns about Darwin's formulations on religious grounds. They made unnecessary the existence of a deity. They led to the grossest materialism. They rejected the concept of immortality, and they removed all moral responsibility of man to God. But then, after enumerating his objections to Darwinism on religious grounds, Hitchcock's offensive pivoted in a new direction. But after all, the real question is not whether these hypotheses accord with our religious views, but whether they are true. He proceeded to make a number of arguments, scientific arguments, against Darwinism. And we might have expected him to leave it there, but he did not. In the end, he added this tantalizing thought on the idea of transmutation of species. The fact that these new creations are repeated at intervals and seem to form a part of a series of operations which we know to be natural makes it quite probable they also are natural. Perhaps this unknown law will by and by be discovered, as many new laws have been, to explain phenomena once supposed to be miraculous because anomalous and inexplicable. Ever the empiricist, the venerable professor from Amherst could not rule out the possibility that species might in fact transmutate or evolve into new species. Had he lived long enough to see additional evidence for Darwin's theories, the indefatigable Edward Hitchcock might well have found a way to accept them, to understand them as all a part of God's plan. Edward Hitchcock's Tree of Life was never intended to suggest any evolutionary relationships among living things. But as the eminent paleontologist J. David Archibald has written, Hitchcock's tree was one of the earliest diagrams of its kind to be published, incorporating both paleontological and geological evidence into a coherent view of the sequence of life forms on Earth. No doubt the insights that tree diagram illustrates were instrumental in leading Hitchcock to those tentative words of consideration, if not outright acceptance of Darwinism he published shortly before his death. It may well have helped other scientists to see the connection between a serial creationist view of the development of life on Earth and the evolutionary view of Charles Darwin. As Archibald has written, although unwittingly, the trees of people like Agassiz, Hitchcock, and Redfield primed the public for accepting, if reluctantly, that trees of life might just represent evolutionary and not merely organizational visual metaphors of life. For many more insights into Edward Hitchcock, I invite you to read my book, All the Light Here Comes From Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock. You might also enjoy visiting my website, www.edwardhitchcock.com, for additional information on the man and the book. Under the section entitled Transcriptions, you will find my transcriptions of many of Hitchcock's unpublished works. Thank you very much for joining me today.